Well, regarding this Lionel Shriver controversy of cultural appropriation, which has become a big news on media these days, I was planning to make video blog, and this is it. I might do it in two different blogs because uh, YouTube doesn't allow me to make a long video as such, so therefore I'll have to break it down into two different parts. Well, now, what is cultural appropriation and what is not cultural appropriation? So, uh, I remember some time ago when I read Vikram Seth's Unequal Music. Uh, into the first few pages, I realized that the character is white. So I began wondering, how can Seth write about a character who is white? How does he know how he thinks? How does he know how he behaves? And being an Indian, how can he get into the mind of a white character? So I thought it was absurd because when I write about the people I know with whom I talk in their language, with whom I talk in their particular idiom about the everyday things that's happening in their lives. But I don't know a thing about a white man, how he thinks. Though I've worked with them for a year in Saudi Arabia, I don't know the white man's mind. They seem totally alien to me. I was working day in and day out with them, but I still don't know how the thought processes work because I'm typically Indian, so I don't know. So Shriver, she's what she says of cultural appropriation is of interest because at that point I didn't believe that Seth could write a book about a white man or his life because he doesn't know. And Shriver is actually is is focusing on this aspect of cultural appropriation, that a white woman cannot write about the life of a black, can write about the life of a black woman. So my idea is to examine whether this is possible in a honest way in which we all writers work, whether cultural appropriation is possible or if it is sort of uh, doable, and if it is fair to do that kind of a cultural appropriation. So Shriver also cites a number of works that would not have been possible if cultural or what do you call appropriation would have been a great thing or a great issue as such. She quotes about Graham Greene's novels, of which I've read a few, which also it doesn't it may be an Englishman who's traveling in India and reports on the kind of English that we speak here in India, which is not cultural appropriation in any way, because it's just an impression and it is just an experience and it is not appropriation of anything as such. But when an Englishman writes about the life of an Indian as an Indian, it becomes a different thing. That means you are internalizing your experience vis-a-vis the Indian, which is wrong, which is not acceptable, which actually is cultural appropriation. For example, she writes about a novel, The Mandibles, in which she says in sorry in she says in that Brisbane conference, in the Mandibles, I have one secondary character, Luella, who is black. She is married to a more central character, Douglas, the Mandible family's 97-year-old patriarch. I reasoned that Douglas, a liberal New Yorker, would credibly have left his wife for a beautiful, stately African American because arm candy of color would reflect well on him in his circle. But in the end, the joke is on Douglas because Luella suffers from early onset dementia, while his ex-wife, staunchly of sound mind, ends up running a charity for dementia research as the novel reaches its climax and the family is reduced to the streets. They are obliged to put the adult disoriented Luella on a leash to keep her from wandering off. On a leash. So this is what is objectionable. Now this keeping Luella on a leash and arm candy for of color is what is appropriation, because a white woman is writing about a black woman and disparaging her life at the same time, which is wrong, which is totally wrong, is an appropriation of the first hand. It doesn't give any sort of what you may call a sympathy or empathy towards the character. So that I would call appropriation. Now, keeping Luella on a leash is not imaginable, because if a white woman writes about it, it would be cruelty. She could be imprisoned the next day. But if a black woman writes about it, about a person who's kept in a leash or something, it could be construed as authentic. It could be construed as being genuine, because you don't know their lives enough, and it could happen in different cultures. But over here, it's just a white woman writing about these things, and directly the allegation comes as to cruelty, which is what it denotes, and the person who's doing this could be in jail. And so it completely sounds fake, to me at least. Now, she apparently forgets that cultural appropriation involves appropriation of the full narrative of the life of the character. So that when it is done across racial divides, it becomes very embarrassing. But if an Indian writes about another Indian who is kept in chains or something like that, it would be believable, because maybe it happens in other cultures, in a different culture. But a white man or a white woman writing about, a white writer writing about this would very much sound like cultural appropriation. Now, in India, and I believe Indians as a race is one, because though sort of syncretization has happened, Indians as such is a racial identity according to me. Now, in India, I write short stories about Malayalis, Marathis, Parsis, Bengalis, Tamilians, and Gujaratis, because I have lived among them and I know the language. I speak to them in their own languages, because since having lived with them, I know the languages they speak, the way they think, and the way they behave. And when I meet a Gujarati or a Maharashtrian, I try to speak in their language to understand them better, to understand their thought processes, their habits, their view of life, their view of this world, etc. Whatever. So I don't think that is cultural appropriation. And also a simile of wearing a sombrero in in some college function or college party or whatever, it doesn't sound too appropriate. It means misappropriation or kind of cultural appropriation for me. Wearing a sombrero is I don't consider it as uh, an appropriation of culture or whatever, because a lot of foreigners, millions of them, thousands of them, they come to India, they wear the sari, they wear the kurta, they wear our headgear, they learn Bharatanatyam, they learn how to dance our Indian dances. That is not cultural appropriation. That is showing empathy for a culture. It's showing sympathy for a culture. So that's, I wouldn't term as cultural appropriation. And among the white writers, William Forster came to India, and he wrote a story, Passage to India, which is totally cultural appropriation, because each of his characters, who's an Indian, he finds some flaws with them, never ever sympathizing with the character. He has no sympathy for the character as such. So that I would consider as cultural appropriation. And he has no, or he shows no kindness to his character. So everybody he describes as weird, and that the way they talk is weird for a Western audience, for the publishers who pay them, for making money in the West, saying this is a great novel, so please read it to understand India. Now, Naipaul, on the other hand, no, Rudyard Kipling, sorry. On the other hand, he was born in India, and he lived in India for some period of time, I think 6 years or so, and he was brought up by his ayah. And in the evening, the ayah would tell him, now go speak to daddy and mummy in English. That means their conversation was so far in Hindi, and they would tell the child, now after dinner, they say, now go and talk to daddy in English. So he was born in India, he knew the Indian ethos, he knew the customs, he knew the language. So I wouldn't classify that as cultural appropriation in any way. But this particular, this Ian Foster that I've talked about, his would be cultural appropriation. It can also happen to people who are expatriates who have been living in foreign countries or foreign lands also. Naipaul is one. Naipaul, for example, he came to India, and when he landed in India, he was driven to his hotel, and he records in one of his books as seeing a long queue of people waiting patiently on the road. Now, this long queue of people